In 1987, a red wolf stepped out of an acclimation pen at Alligator River and onto the Albemarle Peninsula. The entire wild population had been rebuilt from 14 animals. By 2005, 151 wolves moved across 1.7 million acres, 5 counties, the only wild red wolves on Earth. By 2016, fewer than 60 remained. By 2026, 22. Gunshots caused 42% of identified deaths across those years, and the annual share kept rising. They were not taken by disease or drought. Nobody had to shoot them. The coastal South in 1973 was still wolf country. Barely. Federal biologists pushed into the Pocosins and pine flatwoods of Louisiana and Texas, setting traps across miles of roadless marsh. They captured over 400 canids across those years. Most were coyotes, or crosses so diluted the red wolf genome had nearly dissolved into them. The biologists sorted by skull, by pelt, by blood. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch, and what that sorting revealed was not a population in trouble. It was a species already functionally gone from the wild. Out of more than 400 animals captured, 14 were genetically still red wolf. 14. That was the entire species. Point Defiance Zoo took those 14 animals and built a breeding program around them. A federal rule written in 1986 made release onto private land legal. Without it, Alligator River stayed closed to them. Then came 1987. The pen gate opened on the Albemarle Peninsula, and the red wolf re-entered a world that had spent decades forgetting it existed. Over 60 adults were released across the recovery area between 1987 and 1994. The Pocosin swallowed them. Radio collars kept the thread. The population climbed. By 2005, field teams using capture-recapture methods estimated 151 animals moving across 5 counties, the only wild red wolves on the planet, all of them inside those same Pocossins and pine margins. A man on a county road in Hide or Dare could watch federal trucks roll past and know whatever was rebuilt in that Pocossin had come back from something most species never survive. Anthropogenic causes, not disease, not drought, not starvation, killed 73% of every monitored red wolf whose death could be confirmed. Joseph W. Hinton documented it in the Journal of Wildlife Management in 2016. 372 recorded red wolf deaths between 1987 and 2013, and the gunshot share climbing year by year. The collar on a dead wolf does not lie about what stopped it. That number, 372 confirmed dead, sits in a journal. What it does not show you is the ground those animals lived on. You can drive across the entire recovery area on a Tuesday morning, stop for coffee in Manteo, and never once know you are moving through the last wild address of an entire species. The recovery area covers 1.7 million acres, 3 national wildlife refuges, a Department of Defense bombing range, state land, and private property, stitched together into something that looks enormous on a map. And I will tell you what enormous looks like when you compress an entire species into it. In Beaufort County, the road grid cuts through working farms and timber leases, country where a rifle crack at dusk draws no attention and no questions. In Dare County, the refuge holds the core nesting ground, but its eastern edge brushes vacation towns that empty every September. In Hyde County, the Pocossins run deep enough to swallow a pack, but the same drainage canals that made the land farmable carved it into corridors a coyote reads as easily as a wolf. In Tyrrell County, the pine margins thin toward open row crop fields, edge habitat that pulls packs out where they are visible. In Washington County, the western boundary of the whole system meets private timber operations, and the timber roads are open. Hinton et al. Measured it. By 2005, the program had pushed the count to 151 animals moving through those 5 counties, a number that sounded at the time like proof that the wager had paid off. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. The monitoring data underneath that 151 shows the machinery already grinding the wrong direction. Mortality rates that no recovery program can outrun. Gunshot deaths were running at roughly 25% of confirmed kills at the start of the 2000s. By 2013, that share had climbed to roughly 60%. The same recovery area, the same collared animals, the same 5 counties. The land was not shrinking. The threat was not drought or disease boring into the pack from inside. Something was accelerating out there in those 1.7 million borrowed acres, and the collar data showed it building year by year, while the official count still looked like success. A species held inside 5 counties is not a recovery, it is a perimeter. And something outside the wire was learning exactly how thin it was. The 1986 rule that made release legal on private land was not written carelessly. Lawyers argued it, biologists petitioned for it, federal registers recorded it. A legal scaffold built so that red wolves could move across ground that no government truck ever owned. I sorted those canids by skull width and pelt and blood, and I know exactly what it took to hand a living species back to the land. Over 400 animals moved through our traps across those Louisiana and Texas marshes. 14 came out the other side as founders. More than 60 adults were released at Alligator River across a 7-year window, each one a machine rebuilt from almost nothing, set loose into moccasins and farm edges and pine flatwoods that had forgotten what the animals smelled like. A generation of fieldwork, stacked like cordwood, produced a population that climbed to 151 animals by 2005. Then, Joseph W. Hinton published his numbers in the Journal of Wildlife Management, and what those numbers described was not a plateau. It was a disassembly. Hinton documented it in sequence. Between 2000 and 2013, gunshots carved out 42% of every identified red wolf death across the entire recovery area. Not vehicle strikes, not trapping accidents, rifle fire that share did not hold steady. It climbed roughly 25% at the opening of the monitoring window, pressing towards 60% by 2013. The habitat had not changed. The legal framework had not changed. The rifles had simply gotten more frequent. By 2016, the wild count had collapsed from 151 down to somewhere between 45 and 60 animals. A population that had taken 3 decades to assemble was stripped back to a fraction of itself in roughly a single decade. Not by drought, not by disease grinding from inside, but by a force that moved on 2 legs and drove a county road at dusk. And here is what the collar data could not prevent. Coyotes were moving the same corridors. Every breeding season, a red wolf without a mate had a coyote as the only option the landscape offered. Each hybrid litter was not just a genetic dilution, it was a slot that a red wolf pup would never fill. The man in eastern North Carolina who watched the federal trucks pass his county road for 30 years knows this shape of story. Something rebuilt slowly and lost quickly, and not for a reason anyone calls noble. The percosins behind his house still hold the scent of something that was almost brought all the way back. What the data cannot yet tell us is whether the hybridization pressure and the rifle pressure are acting independently, or whether one is accelerating the other in a way the recovery plan was never designed to absorb. The collar count keeps moving downward, and the mechanism behind the rate is still contested. What comes next is the question the captive population in those zoo enclosures is now being asked to answer: whether the genetic archive that 14 animals built is still deep enough to restart what the landscape keeps tearing down. 22 collars, 1.7 million acres. The moccasin does not wait. Deer still thread the shrub margins at dusk, and the browsed edges of bay vegetation still grow back in season. The land runs its machinery with or without the animal that is supposed to regulate it. When the 1987 release put moving predators into that ground for the first time in decades, the chain reaction was immediate and physical. Deer shifted their grazing pressure away from open corridors. Vegetation along those browsed margins began to thicken. The trophic engine turned, slowly, measurably, the way heavy equipment finds its load. That is the cascade the architects of this recovery designed 1.7 million acres of national wildlife refuges, a bombing range, state tracts, and private property to hold. The geography was ready. The legal architecture was in place. The land could absorb a self-sustaining pack structure. As of June 2026, 22 known collared adult and subadult red wolves move across that entire design, not packs filling a landscape. 22 animals threading 1.7 million acres that were built to carry hundreds. I have held a red wolf's skull in both hands in a Louisiana marsh and felt the weight of what was almost gone. What I did not fully anticipate, what none of us did, was the shape of the second pressure that would arrive behind the rifle. Coyotes had always worked this ground, but as the red wolf count thinned, the coyotes did not retreat. They expanded into the gap the wolves had carved. They moved the same corridors, hunted the same prey, and when breeding season arrived, they found the wolves. The result is an animal that is carrying the genetics of both, belonging cleanly to neither species and not the recovered population. The recovery plan was written to protect. The monitoring program now tracks these animals alongside collared wolves, sorting identities in a landscape that no longer sorts them cleanly. Drop your region, and one species you have personally watched disappear from your area in your lifetime. And yes or no in the comments, have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent, because the evidence, fragile and contested as it is, says otherwise. The gear is almost gone, but the land is still turning. Next, Mexican grey wolves in the Blue Range of Arizona and New Mexico, where reintroduction produced a documented uptick in riparian vegetation within a decade of the first release. The New Mexico Cattle Growers Association challenged the experimental population designation in court in 1998, winning a 2-year halt that erased an entire year class of pups from the breeding record. Whether the Blue Range population can now carry enough genetic diversity to avoid the same bottleneck that nearly ended the red wolf. That is the question the field data is still building toward.